Hey guys, my name's Rashad, and I'll be doing the introduction and the assignment for React web development for MSA. Further on in this presentation, you'll hear Pankaj and Ryan, who will take you through some beginning steps of React and our demo that we have in store for you guys. So for the assignment, we want you to do the following. We want you to make a new TypeScript and React web app, and we want you to connect this application to a different third-party REST API than what we use in our demo. We want you to allow users to input information that will be able to be utilized by this API. So think of this as like selecting some text or taking in some date information. We want you to also make use of a UI library like Material UI. And finally, we want you to utilize source control through GitHub. Further, we want you to go and do this Microsoft Learn module, and this is just a basic module on building a simple website. It will teach you just some of the fundamentals of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, which will be useful in our demo. So for the submission, it's super straightforward. All we need is a link to the GitHub repository and a screenshot of the completed Learn module.
Alright, hey guys, my name's Ryan, and today I'll be taking you through the learning outcomes for this module and then some of the beginners section for this. So we'll get started. To get started, you'll need a few of the following things. You're going to need VS Code installed, you're going to need Node.js installed, and you're also going to need a GitHub account. You can optionally install React DevTools extension, but that's more just for debugging, so you can probably get away without it if you don't want it. So, quick disclaimer, if you're already familiar with React, hooks, env files and things like that, then you may want to just skip ahead and go into the Getting Started section, where we have our demo, our demo code. So, otherwise we'll get straight into it. Here, what is React? So React is a JavaScript library that allows us to create user interfaces. And it can also be used on many different platforms. So through React Native and a few other libraries, you can get it on mobile, you can get it server-side rendering and things like that. But for today, we're going to be making a website. So what happens when you start a React app? So when your React site loads for the first time, index.html will load. And that will attempt to start the JavaScript code. If JavaScript isn't enabled on your browser, it won't work. And it'll just display index.html. However, if your browser does have JavaScript enabled, then it'll load index.tsx. If you're curious, you can have a look around in the file structure, but I wouldn't recommend changing anything today, especially if it's your first time around in React. But basically, index.tsx will start app.tsx, which is effectively our main function or our main component. So, what is a component? Components are used to basically create the building blocks for your user interface. So, a component could be as small as a single button or as large as an entire form. So, you can put views or just single components into one component. Here is Hello World in React. So, there are shorter versions. There are much shorter versions that you can get, but this will help me explain how to create a component in React. So if we pull this apart, then what we can see is at the top we have an import statement, then we have a JavaScript function, and then that function is returning a div with Hello World in it. So if you had a look at JavaScript and you had a look at React before, you'll see everything's usually wrapped in a div. But why is it wrapped in a div? So in React, the return method will only take a single parent element. So that means on the left, if you see we've got an h1 tag, a paragraph tag, and a footer tag, you can't have lots of different elements in one return statement. But if you wrap them all in one parent div, then it's fine. So as long as everything's in one parent element, you can have as many different tags and as many different components as you want. Also, it doesn't have to be a div. You can wrap it in any single tag, so any parent tag is fine. Now, another disclaimer, if you have no idea what I've just said, then don't worry, you can quickly jump over to the building a simple website using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript module on MS Learn. So you're going to have to do it either way because both of these are part of the assignment that we're giving you. So if you need to take that one first, then definitely go ahead and do that. Pretty much as I get further through this, it's going to be much more difficult to follow if you don't know JavaScript and HTML already. So exporting and importing components. So if you export a function like this on the right, export default my custom component, as we did with the hello world example, then you can import it as you see at the bottom. So you can just import it by name from the file. But you can also export more than one thing at once. So if you see here, we've got export function quick math. So, and then at the bottom we've also got the constructor exported as export default my custom component. So on the next slide we'll see how that actually looks in an import statement. So if you see here, we have the export default being imported on one line, and then on the next we have quick math being exported in the curly braces. So you can have as many different things imported from one file as you like, and this is just the syntax for that. So this is the section, if you're already familiar with React, quite a lot of the syntax has changed now with React hooks, and I'll take you through that. It can be quite a lot to wrap your head around, so don't worry if you don't get it first time, especially if you're new to React. So what is state? Not like the United States. So state is a way that React can store variables inside a component. React doesn't work like other common patterns you may be used to, like MVC. So in React, the DOM and the state are all very intertwined. So what is visible on the screen is the model and also the view and also the controller. So what is visible to the user? It's also the view, obviously, and then the components are sort of like the controllers. So it's very difficult to compare it to MVC. So your state is not visible on screen, and there we can sort of declare variables that are part of the component scope, but anytime these variables are updated, the component re-renders. So how do you change state? So in hooks, you sort of have these statements here. So the first parameter is the search query, which is the name of the state object, which essentially is our variable. So later in the code, we can reference search query just like any other variable. The second parameter is set search query, which is the method called when you want to change or set the state. So for people who've used previous versions of React, you'll probably understand what I mean, but essentially you can't just change a state variable as if it was a var. You have to call the set state method, and then that will re-render the page. Re-render the component. And then the use state function sets the initial values of state. So for our purposes, you generally want to set the default use state as something similar to your object. So here it's just being set to a string. However, if you're, for example, using an array and you want to use a map function, then you're going to need to set your initial state to a map. Otherwise, it won't be able to use the map function because it won't understand that you can map a default state. Hopefully that makes sense to you guys. But that's pretty much it on state. There's a really good example of this sort of later on in the demo, so don't worry if you didn't get it 100%. But feel free to ask questions in the Discord or on Facebook about this. We'll be happy to work with you on that. Next section, how do I keep API keys safe when I commit on GitHub? Oh jeez, I'll restart the explosion outside. How do I keep API keys safe when I commit on GitHub? Don't commit your API keys. That's the short answer. So keeping your API keys is really important. There are bots that go through GitHub looking for committed keys, and what they try and do is they try and find an API key for your email, or passwords for your email, or your Twilio, or whatever to send text messages, and they rack up massive bills just spamming everyone, and it's not a good look. And particularly on if you leak your GitHub API key or things like that, then they can just use your identity. So it's not great to be committing your key everywhere. So using an env file or an environment file can keep you safe. So how to do this in your project? What you want to do is you want to add .env.local to your gitignore file. It should already be in there, but just have a check to be safe. I've seen it quite a few times where I've told people about env files, and then they go and create one, and then they commit the env file, which is solely a file full of all their passwords and API keys. Not great. So don't do that. But once you've created the env local file, you can add your secrets like this, and the syntax for that will be shown in the image there. And the reason you need to have the React _app_ before you just declare your API key is basically because you need to tell React that you know what you're doing, you know that you're importing this variable, and that React is supposed to be calling this variable. So, and then in step 4, you have the line of code you're going to have to run, and then that will just reference it as a string. So then that will be able to call it, and then you'll be able to use your API key just like any other string in your program. But when you commit that, obviously your key won't be committed. It'll just have the line process.env.react API key. Now the next question that usually comes up is, well, if I have an env local file, how do I get that to work on a server? Or how do I get that to work on someone else's computer, or and things like that? So an env file or environment is often used so that on a local machine you have your local environment, the dev staging server will have its environment, and then the production server will have a production environment variable. So this allows you to keep the same code but have different secrets for each, and then it can even be used to run different pieces of code depending on the environment. So quite often when you have logging and other things on your APIs and on your backends and your front ends, you want slightly different behavior depending on whether it's public or private facing. But essentially most hosting providers will allow you to store your environment variables secretly on their servers as well. So you'll set that up on the server side when you host it. And that's pretty much it for the basics. And yeah. Thanks, guys.
Hey guys, my name is Pankaj, and today we'll be developing NASA image search web app. In this web app, a user provides a search string such as Jupiter. They also provide a start date and an end date. Let's set the start date to be 2012, and let's keep the end date to be 2020. Now let's press submit. What this web app does is it fetches all the images that are related to the search string Jupiter from the NASA's API and displays them on the screen. As you can see, this is quite a big web app, so we'll be developing this web app today. For the API, we're using NASA's API. So if you type NASA API on Google and click on the first link, this will take you to the NASA's API website. Now, if you scroll all the way to the bottom and click on NASA Image and Video Library, so this is the API that we're using for this project. If you click on this link over here, This will take you to the documentation of this API. This is a PDF file. You can read this documentation to have a better understanding of how this API works. Now, we will start developing the web app. First of all, we will need to create a React project. We can do this by running this command on the terminal. I have already created a React project, as you can see on the left. Now, to run this project, we can use the npm run start command. But before we do that, we need to cd into our project folder and then run npm run start. This will open up a local developer server and open up our web app in that. So it just opened up the developer server and this is our web app. Now we'll make changes to it. First of all, we'll get rid of some of the stuff that comes pre-built in. So we will get rid of this and the CSS file that came with it, because we wouldn't be using this for this project. Now we'll make our first component, which is the search bar component, which is this component right here. This component includes the search field, the two date pickers, and the submit button. To do that, first of all, we'll need to create a folder inside the src folder, and we will call this folder components. Inside the components folder, we'll create another folder and we'll call it search bar component. Inside the search bar component folder, we'll create a file and we'll call it searchbar.css. We'll also create a file called searchbar.tsx. Now, we'll make a functional component in the searchbar.tsx file. Before we go any further, we need to install Material UI to our project. You can do this by running this command onto the terminal. This will install Material UI to your project folder. We'll be making use of Material UI for this project. Now, we'll make the text field, which is this over here. To do that, we're making use of the grid component and the text field component that we get from Material UI. The grid component makes sure that our text field is being displayed nicely in all the different devices, and the text field displays the text field on the display. If you look at the onChangeEven handler, it calls a handle search query function, which is this function over here. This function accepts a string and sets the search query to the input that it gets. This input is the search string that the user entered in the text field over here. Now, we will need to install these two libraries before we can add the date pickers to our project folder. You can simply run this command onto the terminal to install these two libraries. I have already installed these libraries on my project folder, so I don't have to install them now. Now, we'll make use of these two imports. We have two date pickers, one for the start date and one for the end date. Therefore, we have two states, one for the start date and one for the end date. We also have two handlers, one for the start date and one for the end date. Now, let's add the date pickers to our file. If you look at the onChange handler of the start date, this calls handle start date change function. This function sets the start date to the new date that the user entered. Similarly, if you look at the onChange of the end date handler of the end date, this calls a handle end date change function. This function sets the end date to the date that the user just entered. Now we have a text field and a start date and end date picker. Now we need to add a submit button to our search bar. To do that, we'll make use of the grid component and the button component that we get from Material UI. So the grid component makes sure that our button, the text field, and the two date pickers are being displayed nicely, and the button component displays a button onto the display. We also need to import the button component to our file. So let's do that. Now, we'll create a iUserInput interface. We'll be using this interface quite a lot in this project. So what we will do is we'll make a common interface in a file so that we can import this interface in all the other files in which it requires, so that we don't have to create this interface again and again and again. To do that, what we will do is we will create a common folder in the src folder. And we'll create a file inside this common folder, and we'll call it interfaces.tsx. Inside this file, we'll create our iUserInput interface. This interface contains three fields: search query, start date, and end date. We can simply import this interface in all the other files in which it requires. We will need this iUserInput interface in this file, so let's import it. To do that, we will write import iUserInput from the interfaces file that we just created. This will import the iUserInput interface to this file. Now we can make use of it. If you look at the button component, and on the onClick event handler, this calls a handleSubmit function. So we will need to create this function. What this function does is it first checks the search query. If the length of the search query is 0, that means that the user hasn't really entered anything in the field, and there is no point in fetching the data from the API. So if the length of the search string is 0, then we will not do anything. If the length of the search query is not 0, then we will call a function. We'll first create an object called userInput, which will be of type iUserInput interface that we just created, and this will contain search query, start date, and end date fields. And we'll pass this object to a prop function that's called setUserInput that we get from the parent function. This function will accept an object of type iUserInput. So we're just passing this object to the function that we got from the parent. Now, we will need to define an interface for the props for this component. As we just talked about, we are accepting a function as a prop, which is setUserInput, which is over here. So we will need to say props of type iSearchBarProps. So this props has a type of this, and this prop contain a property which is setUserInput, which is a function which accepts a iUserInput interface, iUserInput object. So that's it for the searchbar.tsx file, but we can't really display this file onto the web page at the moment because it will give us errors. Let's look at the errors first. So to display it, we'll need to write import search bar from components / search bar components / search bar, and we'll display it on the screen. But you'll soon see that this will give us errors because the searchbar.tsx file is accepting some props, but we haven't really passed any props here. To make it work, we'll make some changes to the searchbar.tsx file so we can see this component on the screen. Now if we save it and go to our React app, we can see that there is a text field, 2 date pickers, and a submit button. But at the moment, this is not really centered, so it doesn't really look nice. So let's add some CSS. So this is the CSS that we'll be adding. Now, if you save it and go back to the React tab, we can see that all the components are centered nicely and it looks a little bit nicer. So that's it for the search bar component. Now, we'll create the media card component, which is this component right here. This component contains an image and a description. As you can see, we are making use of this component again and again and again. We're just changing the image and the description that we pass to this component. So, to make this component, first, we'll need to make a folder inside the components folder, and we'll call it media card.component. Inside this folder, we'll create a file and we'll call it mediacard.css. We'll make another file and we'll call it mediacard.tsx. Now we'll make the media card component inside this file. As you can see, we are making use of the card component, the card action area component, the card media, and card content component that we get from Material UI. You might be wondering, well, how do I know all this? How do I know the structure? Well, if you go to Material UI and search for card and click on it, and if you scroll all the way to the bottom, you can see the card you see over here is very similar to the card I have over here. Well, if you click on this icon over here and press on TypeScript, you can get the TypeScript version of this code. You can simply copy this code to your project to get this card. You can also make changes to this code as per required to change the card. Now coming back to our media card component, this component accepts two props, image URL and description, that we will be changing when we reuse this component. To display the image, we are using card media component and we're passing it the image URL. And for the description, we are making use of the topology component that we get from Material UI, and inside it we are displaying props.description, which is a description that is related to this image. So that's it for the media card component. Now we'll make the media grid component. But before we do that, we also need to add CSS for this component. So let's do that. Now we will make the media grid component. Media grid component is a grid that contains all these cards. To make this grid, we first need to make a folder inside the components folder, and we'll call it media grid component. Inside this folder, we'll create a file and we'll call it mediagrid.css. We'll make another file and we'll call it mediagrid.tsx. Now let's add the CSS for this component first. Now for the mediagrid.tsx file, we'll first make a functional component, which is this component right here. Then we'll make an interface called iState. This will contain two properties, links and data. Both will be an array. This is the interface for the data that we receive from the API. To call the API, we first need to use the useState hook to create a state for the data that we receive from the API. We're making use of the useState hook over here, and we're making an items array for the item that we receive from the API. Now we're making use of useEffect hook to call the API. useEffect hook accepts two parameters, the first parameter being a function and the second being an array. The second parameter is called a dependency array. Whenever an element inside the dependency array gets updated, it reruns the function that is the first parameter of this useEffect hook. Let's say if a user changes a search string to search string, this props.searchString property will be changed. Then the useEffect hook will fetch the new data from the API. Similarly, if a user changes the start date or an end date, the useEffect hook will call the fetch request again and will get the new data from the API. Now, we will make use of the data that we received from the fetch request. First, we will create a cards array whose element will be of type jsx.element. Then, we will loop through the item array, which contains the data from the fetch request. Then, we will use the forEach method to loop through the item array. The forEach method accepts a function as an argument, which is this function over here. This function will accept two arguments. The first argument will be the element of the JSX of the item array, and the second argument will be the index of this element. Inside this function, we are checking if the item array is empty or not. Well, if the item array is empty, then there is not really a point of making a card out of it. So if the item array is empty, we're simply returning. If it's not empty, then we'll make a card. To make a card, we're using the grid component from the material UI and the media card component that we created before this one. This media card component will accept two props, image URL and description. And then we are pushing this JSX element to the cards array. Now, all we need to do is display this cards array onto the web page. To do that, we're making use of the grid component that we get from material UI and the cards array. So we're using the grid component so that our cards are being displayed nicely on all the different devices. And then we are writing cards inside the curly braces. This will render all the JSX elements that are inside the cards array. Now, we're pretty much done with the media grid.tsx file. Now all we need to do is wire things up. So if we go back to our app.tsx file, we need to make changes to this file now. First of all, we need to create a user input state. We're doing this over here. This state will be of type iUserInput. Remember, we created a common interface over here in the interfaces.tsx file. We will just import this interface to this file so that we don't have to create this interface again and again. Let's copy the import first. Then we're creating a function called setUserInput. This function accepts a object of type iUserInput and then sets or updates the user input to the object that it received. We need to pass this function to the search bar component that we created. So let's pass it. And we'll set it equal to the function, which is this one over here. Remember, we made some changes to the search bar component so that we can display it on the web page. Now, we need to revert those changes. So let's do that. So we need to uncomment this bit. And we also need to define props. So props type interface iSearchBar props. So that's it. Now we need to wire up our media grid. This media grid accepts three props. The first one is search query, the second one is start date, and the third one is end date. we're passing these props from the app.tsx file. These props are being stored in the user input.search query, which is the object over here. We are getting the search query from the search bar component. We are passing the set user input so that the search bar component can update the user input object from the search bar component. And then we are passing these properties to the media grid component so that it can display the cards on the screen. Now, we also need to add some breakpoints. This ensures that our web page is being displayed nicely on all the different devices. Now, all we need to do is add material UI theme provider and wrap our components in that so that the breakpoints can be applied to them. Now, we're pretty much done. So let's just save it. And we have an error. Let's go back to media grid and we need to fix this import. So that should fix the import. Now let's just save it. And we are done. So if you look at our web page, this is our web page. Now let's say let's search for something. Let's search for Pluto and let's set the start date to be 2012 and let's change the end date to be 2018 and let's press search. As you can see, it's working. We're making use of the card component again and again and again. We're just changing the image and the description. And we're making use of the media grid component to show this card component nicely on the screen. We're using the search bar component to display this search field to input to date pickers and the submit button. And that's it. Hope you guys enjoyed.